Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, the podcast where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. I'm Dr. Philip Brown with my good friend, Dr. Terry Jackson, and you're at the intersection. Fascinating thing about intersections, we all face many intersections daily. The way we navigate these determines the trajectory of our day and our life. We got an interesting spin type topic today, Terry. We're going to, instead of, I told you so, today our topic is I told me so.
Yeah, that's very interesting because all of us go through self-talk on a day-to-day basis. The key is, what are we telling ourselves when we have those conversations with ourselves, right? And, just how do we break the cycle of some of the conversations that we have with ourselves to ensure that we're telling ourselves good, positive information on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah, it's so true. And I think sometimes it starts with what we ingest, right? And so from a young age, I know I was always taught, be careful what you say, all right? And at the same time, sticks and stones on the other side of that, right?
Right.
But words really do hurt. I mean, no matter what source you look at, whether, biblical or anything else, actually, those words are very powerful in a lot of cases. But that power is what we impose on them when we hear them. That's a lot of times. And so I've kind of come up with a new mantra for the next month or so that I'm going to try to put into practice, and that is be careful what I hear.
Yes, that's extremely important, right? It's like when we talk about feeding the body, we talk about, we have to be mindful of the food that we intake, but we have to be mindful of the information that we intake as well. Because given the mood that you may or may not be in, you may take it one particular way one time, you may take it another particular way another time. So we have to be mindful of what we feed ourselves mentally as well as physically.
And I just sit there and I think, one of the things I've been working on for years, we've talked about in several different episodes, is, from a leadership standpoint, always suspend judgment, right? Like, because as soon as you make a judgment, you start closing down options. And it takes you down a certain path. And so by being careful what I hear, it basically is an acknowledgement that I'm going to immediately put interpretation into whatever it is that I've just heard. I can't really help it, but I can be aware that that's there. And then from that, I can be really careful about the stories I tell myself about what I just heard. And I think that's the key. And you and I have talked a lot of times, and we're doing a lot of it in our creativity and personal mastery class, writing it down, right?
Yes.
Like write that thing down and vet it through your own experiences.
That's right. Because, I can tell you sometimes I'm writing things down, or more importantly, I might be texting something to someone, right? And I read something and I begin to text and I'm like, oh, let me erase that. Or I write it down. I say, nope, that's not what I want. So let me scratch through it, because I want to be mindful of what I say to myself. I want to be mindful of what I say to others. And I want to be mindful of what it is that I hear, because all of that brings energy to us, right? And there's certain energies I just don't want to be affiliated with, right? And so by writing it down, it will enable me to kind of, I'm going to say, manifest something, right? Because I found in my history that when I write things down, the more I write things down, the more I get things done.
Yeah, there's that incredible tendency to have a list, scratch something off a list because you did it. So it imposes a certain sense of urgency that you may not have otherwise, right? It's almost like a promise you do to yourself or give to yourself. I do that all the time in terms of this list-making phenomenon. In fact, since I got laid off a few weeks ago, I've already worked through one whole legal pad of list items of stuff that I neglected. So Christy and I have been working on this list of things, mostly around home or other things that from our just personal business that we needed to attend to that had been deferred over time. But it's amazing. You put it on a list, it gets done.
That's right.
You know, and it's amazing too because there's something self-perpetuating about that because interestingly, we crossed all that stuff off the list and now we made another list. That's a whole nother legal pad long of other stuff that needs to be done, you know, and it has a deep way of attaching you to getting something done.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I was telling you earlier, before the episode, we were having a conversation. I said, I remember my senior year in college at North Carolina Central University, the capstone course was business policy. And Dr. Jan made us read Think and Grow Rich. And then it talked about writing things down. And I began to write things down. And somehow I misplaced that particular notebook. But when I found it years later, I went through all that I'd written down. I was like, wow, I accomplished all of that. And then I began writing down even more. And then when I kind of went through a lull in my life, I was trying to figure out why am I not accomplishing things that I normally would accomplish? And I attribute it to the fact that I wasn't writing it down. So I started writing things down again. And just to fast forward, I think there's what I want to call it, a couple books that are coupled together that I've read, and I think you've read, Quantum Leap Strategy, U Squared, and the journal, the Pursuit Journal that comes with it. And as I went through the Pursuit Journal, and you know the goals that I'd written down, and even I went as far to cut out pictures, right? I was like, wow, I've achieved all this, right? So there is a power to all of that.
I think sometimes what happens to me is I can't quite get the words for something to put it into written form. You know, like it's somewhere between a thought and a feeling, and you know, the sense of what needs to happen. And what I've begun to gravitate to, and this is like Aisha Bursell, that was one of our former guests on the show and one of our colleagues in MG100. I've sort of started using illustration a little bit, right? And then over time, that illustration, I can then eventually articulate some words out of it. But if I just let it dwell out there as a thought or as a concept, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
I got to get it down somewhere so I can revisit it, refine it, maybe bounce it off of other people. You know, one of the most powerful things is the conversation that you have with somebody else that helps bring clarity.
That's right. That's right. And I'm careful who I do that with as far as telling someone what my goal or vision may be, because everybody can't accept it, because you know we just have different experiences in life. But when I write it down, I might toss it out there arbitrarily, just to not to anyone in specific, just to get feedback on it, right? Or I double down on my reading, and I double down on my writing, and things get done. I'll tell you what I'm real amazed at. There's a gentleman that I follow on Facebook, and I saw where he just published over the last 6 or 7 years, 6 or 7 books, 1,000 pages or more, that he just wrote over that period of time, right? And I'm like, wow, you want to talk about focus, and you want to talk about writing it down, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and he's a college professor, and he writing it down, and he's showed pictures of all of his, I guess, notebooks and how he had them all taped together so that it allowed him to do this, accomplish this feat. And I was like, man, that's amazing. And so I began to ask myself, well, what is he doing that I'm not doing, right? Not in a comparison, but there's got to be certain things that just not a part of his environment that allows him that, it gives him that time. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it makes me think of the question, what do you practice, right?
Right.
Because in order to be so prolific, he has to have a practice or set of practices that he adheres to.
Yes.
All right, because you're talking about 7,000 pages worth of books in
Right.
5 or 6 or 7 years.
Right.
You know, so it's a practice. And I just saw it recently. There's a YouTube video. Maybe we can dig it up and link it. But it's a little kid about what do you practice, and he keeps asking the question, "What do you practice?" Because whatever you practice, you'll get really good at. And you know, the YouTube is around, you know, using care not to practice, you know, being angry or feeling persecuted. You know, like all these kind of things that, you know, if you start practicing something of finding fault, you'll find it.
That's right.
You know, if you start a practice that says, I'm going to look for options, you're going to find a lot of options out there. And that gets really back to our title
That's
of
right.
I Told Me So,
That's
right? Is when we practice through the act of writing and paying attention to what the stories we're telling ourselves in our mental chatter or internal voice, whatever you want to call it, that awareness brings with it opportunity.
Yep. It's interesting because sometimes I'll have friends ask me, well, man, did you hear about this? Did you see this? And I'm like, no, I'm in my own little world. I'm not in that space or in that environment because my focus is here versus there. So there's certain things that maybe I should know that I don't know simply because I choose not to know. Right? I choose not to be in that space. And in choosing not, it's what I'm telling myself. I'm not in that space. I'm not going to be in that space. And so it also enables me not to hear that. And so if I don't hear that, then I'm not going to tell myself a story about that or make up a story about that because it's just not where my interests are. And I, you know, sometimes people might think I'm trying to be however they describe me, right? But that's not. I'm just focused on what I'm focused on. And I'm not in that world because I don't want to tell myself that because I understand the power of words and I understand the power of thought, right? And so there's certain places I just don't want to go.
It's the old saying, what somebody else thinks of me is none of my business.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
And there's such a focus power that exists when you apply yourself in a direction and basically refuse to take in distracting stimuli. You know, because I've also come to believe, and in fact, as I was writing out some of my own mental chatter yesterday along the way, you know, distraction is the ultimate enemy. You know, and we're meaning-making machines. We get distracted. We follow this line of thought that ultimately is likely to take us into our areas of greatest bias because it can, at some point, it just gets you to a place where it's based on your own life experiences, you know, and then next thing you know, you've created this entire story about what something is that has no resemblance to what was intended by the original statement.
That's right. And you know what I really love about I Told Me So, right? The whole belief about it, right? The belief of self that I know that I can do regardless of what anyone else may have said, regardless of what picture anyone else may have painted, you know, about me, regardless of the stereotypes or the images, right? If I'm telling me what I can and can't do, it doesn't matter what anyone else says, right? Because I'm going to create that story. Because if I'm just listening to me, I like to think I'm going to do what's in the best interest of me and what's around me versus the best interest of, you know, someone else. And it's too many times, I think, when other people tell something to someone, if they don't listen carefully to themselves, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? And those things do happen because they heard it when they probably shouldn't have listened to it, good or bad. And let me not use the label good or bad. However it happened, right? When you tell yourself the story, that's what you normally do.
It's basically like the only fulfilled prophecies are self-fulfilling, right? Like, you know, otherwise, how would it actually get done? If we don't ultimately, begin to believe that story and begin to take certain actions that are consistent with that story. And it kind of reminds me of the old, tongue in cheek, don't confuse me with the facts.
That's right.
Like,
that's right.
and it's so interesting how powerful our convictions can be in the face of tons of evidence to the contrary. Right? And we just will not allow ourselves sometimes to be open to an alternate reality. And for me, the useful thing, again, really has been writing it down sometimes. Sometimes just seeing something that's kind of cockamamie, I'll say, yeah, that's not it, Chief. And other times, it allows me to put myself into a brainstorming state of mind, so I can say, well, this might be true, but what else might also could be true?
Right.
And again, catalog those things, and it takes you to a place where you end up saying, gosh, how many potential realities are there? And it's a lot, right? Like, it's basically infinite for anybody.
It really is. And last week was a big week as far as for me cataloging, and then seeing action happen toward that cataloging, right? And it's consistent with me telling myself certain things. I expressed to you a couple of opportunities that presented themselves that I'm going to have follow-up conversations this week, right? That came from cataloging, writing things down. It also came from me having this constant conversation with myself around who I am, what I do, right? Which is different. Who I am and what I do is totally different. I understand that. But in understanding the role that I play from a consultant, leadership development kind of guy, right? There's certain things that I wanted to happen. And it was interesting that when I wrote certain things down, those things happened, right? And then there was another organization that gave me a call, and we had actually two conversations. They took up a bunch of my time from the NCAA tournament, right? But they were great conversations. But it's interesting in what I was telling myself, the story of me telling myself what it is, what I do, what I want to achieve, writing it down, how all of a sudden it was like this huge wave came all at one time. And I was like, wow, this is all at one time. But it's also consistent with what I wanted. It's consistent with what I wrote down. It's consistent with what I was telling myself. So there's some magic to that.
It is magic. And it is, it allows you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise see.
Yes.
Because you're distracted on other thoughts. It's using bias for good, right? In a way, right? We all carry bias with us all the time because we only have a limited set of experiences, no matter who we are. Those put our brain in a certain state of self-protection that creates a lot of these biases. And so, when you set yourself up through writing, through telling yourself something, you're basically putting yourself into a heightened state of awareness, paying attention for certain things. And once you start collecting evidence, again, I would recommend writing it down. Once you start collecting evidence that things are going a certain way, it's almost exponential. Back to the quantum leap, U squared. It's almost exponential how fast it begins to subsequently accumulate.
I agree with you. I go right back to the alternate reality. And for those who may not know what alternate reality is, it's really the reframing of a situation. For instance, we can't change what has happened to us, but we can change the story that we tell ourselves around what's happened to us. And so as I've created and living this alternate reality, I have begun to see evidence of that alternate, reality. And the most important thing for me is the alternate reality was written by someone else. Meaning, as I tossed out my reality and the other people wrote out what they thought my alternate reality would be, as I looked at one and I bought into it and I wrote it down myself, the evidence began to show up. And part of the evidence is the conversations I told you, the emails that I received and the people who contacted me. It was part of that, right? And it goes to the question that Einstein asked, which was probably his most important question, and that was, is the universe friendly?
Right, the ultimate question.
Yes, is
that
the
and do
universe
we
friendly?
exist?
Yes.
And so, interestingly, you just described converting something into a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like when you accepted that the proposed alternate reality that somebody else helped you with could be a viable reality, all of a sudden you began to do things, look for things, find things that substantiated it. And so it became the current reality. And that's really the way it works a lot of times, right? Because the possibilities are almost unlimited, but we are limited in terms of what we can do in a given time-space continuum. And so we have the ability to breathe life into only a certain number of alternate realities at a given time. And where we put our energy, where we put our awareness, is where things start to happen.
And as I reflect on all of this, I can go back to, again, when I was in college, and I told me so. Right? I told me so. I told me that I could accomplish these particular things. I didn't listen to other influences. I didn't let other people influence my behavior particular ways. I didn't go into certain environments, right? And the reason I didn't do it is because I told me that if I did those things, I couldn't do the things that I'm doing now. So I told me so a long time ago, and I'm just living into what I told me, which is very interesting.
And we have to be careful of the evil twin, I told you so.
Yeah.
Because embedded in there immediately is judgment. Right? You're saying, I was right about this. And a lot of times you really weren't. There's things that you just don't happen to see that are part of the constellation. And there's almost no situation when I think about it that telling somebody I told you so is helpful.
Yes.
But man, we have a tremendous tendency to do that. I mean, I've certainly done it, and I think that it comes maybe from a sense of a need to self-validate, right? Like to prove that you're worthwhile because you knew, you magically knew what was going to happen in a given situation, even though in reality there's so many variables out there. It's hard to know what will really happen or what it means until after. And even our after stories, how we put it together, we select certain evidence as valid, certain evidence as invalid, and on and on and on. Even the story we tell after is just one of the possibilities of how we got to a place. So gotta be careful.
That's right. Oftentimes I told you so is not used in a good light, right? It's the self-validation, arrogance, a sense of I'm more intelligent. It's always used for the most part of the time, most of the time, in a descending kind of way. It's a few times. I remember hearing a story. There's a guy named D.L. Hughley. He's a comedian, and he had a son who was in high school, and his son had a disability, and the son ended up graduating with honors and applying to college. And when he asked his son, how did you accomplish all this against the odds of, your disability? And he says, Dad, because you told me so. And that was his only response, because you told me so. And so we have to be mindful of our words, what we say to others. We have to be mindful of what others say to us. And we have to have the ability, if someone says something to us that's not good, we have to be able to have the ability to reject that, right? Not let it rent any space in your mind and your thoughts, right? And that comes from a lot of the, the CPM that we've gone through, that whole, how do you gain this mastery, right? So that you can accept and reject, accept what needs to be accepted and reject, or instead of rejecting, maybe even reframing, right? The alternate reality. How do you reframe that for good? It's like when we had Dr. Tom Morris in here, and he was talking about the lemonades, right? And he went through that story. Then I had a friend from Senegal who called and said, no, we don't accept the lemon. So we never make lemonade. We toss it out. I was like, wow, interesting.
Different school of thought, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we don't accept it. We toss it out. Yeah.
Well, you hit on a topic right there that is pretty fascinating too, and we kind of see it play out all the time. It's in the parenting world. I think my parents and what Christy and I have tried to do with our kids is open up the possibility that ultimately they can take many different tracks, right? Mm-hmm. And hopefully that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for them, that they go and seek and explore and find and do things. There's also the opposite thing that happens if parents don't do that, or if systems that are in place set different expectations from that. And that's where it gets to what you were just talking about, is that every individual is well served by the ability to reject something that's not consistent with where they would like to see themselves move. And it's a hard thing, and it develops a pattern whenever whenever it starts young, and those young impressionable minds that basically, begin to have limits imposed upon them from very early on. It's a lot tougher than if it's less limited from the beginning. But that's one of the areas I think that we have to coach kids. One of the great things that sports do, right, is really teach kids that, we're going to give you this skill, and then you can grow with it into whatever comes next, and you can also use these lessons in other areas.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was very open, with my daughter, and just let her continue to grow and spread out. And then I got to the point where I started observing her, and I was like, wow, I got to start reining this in a little bit, right? All this creativity and innovation and this all of this thought, now it needs to be reined into purpose, to a specific purpose. And it's been beautiful to see how that's happened, because, in her journey that she decided to take, she's finally ended up a chemist with Pfizer, right? But there was a time I'm just looking at her, I'm like, so what are you going to do? Right? Because she has all of these thoughts and all these ideas that's all over the place, which was, wasn't a bad thing at all. It was a great thing. But, I started planting a little seed here, a little seed there, and then all of a sudden I could see it raining in, and then all of a sudden she's like, okay, I got the position at Pfizer. I was like, oh, well, okay. So it was well worth it. But just the experience of letting children know that there are all types of opportunities out there. But at some point in time, you got to be able to rein it in, and you can make mistakes, but you got to be careful what you let someone tell you, and you got to be careful what you tell yourself. Those are the two, I think, the biggest things that you can ever, as a child, when you're young and you're impressionable, be careful what you accept when someone tells you that, and be mindful of what you're telling yourself, because you can hear it in the language. When they begin to, those stories begin to go over and over, you hear the language, you're like, I've heard this from you 3 or 4 times. So we need to have a conversation about that, because let me give you a different perspective.
Well, one of the things that you and I have in common is career changers, right? Like we've had different careers over time. And what you tell yourself is critical when you're making one of those shifts. I mean, you have to be willing to, you really have to be willing to suspend judgment in those transitions big time in order to see the options. You know, which exit do I want to take to get off the interstate? You know, which thing am I going to pivot my focus to next? And that's all about stories that you tell yourself. And they can either be limiting or they can be things that build you up and create options.
Yeah.
And it's a practice.
That's right. It's a practice, because guess what? I don't know about you. I'm just going to speak for me. There are times where the confidence just wasn't there. Whatever was happening at that time, right? You know, I've made this decision and things are going well initially, then all of a sudden things are not going as you want them to go. And, you know, it kind of, you know, chinks at the armor a little bit of confidence, and confidence, and then you get back on the horse and something else happened. But ultimately you believe in you, right? I ultimately believe in me. But still, being a human being, there's stories that begin to create, right? And then I have to remember the ultimate story of what I told myself, right? And not let the distractions, as you mentioned, get in the way. And then, you know, as I look at my journey, I'm like, wow, you know, I told me so. It may not necessarily have been like I wanted it to, the journey to go, but I did tell myself this, and it is happening, right? So I'm evidence that, you know, things can happen by telling yourself certain things.
Well, there's power. You know, some folks call it surrender. I kind of prefer the term acceptance. That anytime we have an awareness of ourself, we're okay in that moment, right? Accept the fact that we're okay. We're complete human beings. There are some options to go forward from that place. And the story we tell ourselves at those moments where things are uncomfortable are one of those intersections that we come to that determines the trajectory of our life.
Right, that's right.
And if we can just get with the fact that, you know, it's okay right now. I am not necessarily this. I'm just in this. And that whole concept of watching yourself, like that's been another very powerful tool that I've been really experimenting with a ton during this creativity and personal mastery, is just watching myself do something, being a casual observer of whatever role I'm playing. And in fact, I'll tell a story. One of the things that I did with, thank God Christy was there to help me and keep me on track, is I cleaned out my home office and reorganized it. And I had, you know, I'm a note taker, and I got notebooks everywhere and scraps of paper and different kind of things and stacks of books all over. It was terrible. But I reorganized that. And as a part of that, put a new bookshelf there. And I realized that, you know, as some of my stuff came from my work office, I had all this stuff, and there are different things that are, I'll say, that commemorate roles that I've held. You know, and maybe it was a job, maybe it was a certification, maybe it was an award of some type. And now every time I go and I sit in there to work or to journal or to just stare out the window and think, I look at those things and I think about not that that was me that did that, but that was a role I was in, right? That, in my case, that God was working through me to be this particular position for a period of time. And that is a powerful, powerful tool. It automatically does for you some things that we've talked about. It automatically changes what you're telling yourself.
Yep, that's right.
Because when I look at those, I mean, so many different. I've been a surgeon, I've been an executive, I've been a basketball coach, been a volunteer. And all along that way, those were different stories that I told myself. I feel like I acted in good faith to serve the greater good in those roles, not 100% because nobody can. I was also fulfilled through those roles, right? Because I also kind of believe that none of us are really able to act outside our self-interest at the time. And that self-interest may change, and it may have big time altruistic roots because it makes us feel good to serve the greater good. That sense of purpose that is of value to humankind is an elevator for everyone. But just watching that and realizing that none of those people was actually me, I'm just watching it happen. I'm just a vessel for certain things that happened. Has really helped me in this transition that I'm in now in terms of, having just been laid off. I'm like, well, that was just a role I was playing at the time. What's the role I'm playing right now? Mostly husband and father, podcaster. I mean,
it takes a lot to be able to make that distinction because there's so many people who identify themselves by what they do, not necessarily the role that they're playing at that time, right? Whatever our occupation is what our role is, right? Whether you're an attorney, a physician, an accountant, that's what you do, not who you are. And the knowledge of self, you mentioned that earlier, which is probably it is the most important knowledge that one can have, to have that the knowledge of self and the awareness of yourself, and to be able to sit back and observe yourself and your actions and observe your thoughts as we talk about mental chatter, because mental chatter makes up our world, right? It makes our world what it is, and we all live in a matrix, and that matrix is a matrix that we've created given our thoughts. But being able to be aware of that and being able to observe that so that you can create the alternate realities, right? And you get to know the true authentic self versus the ego that normally accompanies the role that you're playing. Because with that role comes an ego, and we have to be mindful, of that.
And, one of the things that I've decided going forward in the work that I do, I'm only going to work with people that are willing to do the self-work now.
Right, that's it.
Right? Like, I've been down that road actually a lot of times where, sometimes your set of responsibilities necessitates that you work with a group of people, whether they're interested in whatever you're doing or not. That's just who you inherit as a team, right? That's a different world now, right? To me, a lot of gain can be made by working with people who are serious about doing the self-work, because from a leadership standpoint, it is 100% self-work.
Yep.
There is nothing else.
That's right.
There is nothing else that reaches the level that a lot of leaders need to be at than self-work.
That's right. That's right. And it's I think Marshall Goldsmith says he helps successful people become more successful. And those people are successful because they know the investment that's needed to discover who they are and do the self-work, right? So if you're not willing to do the self-work, which is required in everything that you do, regardless of what role you might be playing, the self-work is needed. And for those people who don't understand the importance of doing the self work, then I don't want to deal with them either, right? They got to understand, the benefit of the self work, because as Dr. Rao tells us, the only job that we have is to bloom. That means that the only job we have is to work on ourselves. That's the only job. And as we work on ourselves and do the self work, all the other roles that we play will improve.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, an instrument of a higher power, right?
Yes.
by making the best version of ourselves through what we tell ourselves, we can become a very potent tool for higher powers to help others, whether it's compassionate leadership that we've had a recent episode on, or inspirational leadership, or any role, right? As long as we are in tune with what's happening through us, we have a chance to do great things, or to have great things happen through us, and that's very fulfilling.
Right. And for me, regardless of what I do and what role I may play, what I like to use as the analogy is, there's always room for me to go from being a caterpillar to a butterfly. That room is always there, regardless. In each role, I may not necessarily be a butterfly in every role, but that means that I have room to do, and that there's self-work that I need to do in order to become that butterfly, right? And so that's why I like that, because oftentimes when we come out the other end, we're not going to look the same. We're not going to be the same. We're not going to think the same, right?
Well, I hope not. I mean, that's the thing. The whole piece of constant change is very renewing, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really, struck by this. The stories we tell ourselves are the enablers of that transformation.
That's right.
Or the disablers.
That's right.
Of that transformation. And we can go on and on in circles about it if we really want to. But the truth of it, plain and simple, is that every limitation that any of us has is either made more limiting, less limiting, or held at the status quo by a story that we tell ourselves.
That's right.
And when we find a situation that is a repeat situation, let's say there's a constant burr under your saddle, or a constant situation that I feel like is not going well, underneath that, there's a story that I've been telling myself that's created a pattern of behavior that I am continuing to execute over and over and over again to create that outcome that I don't want. And so having the humility to say, this keeps happening, it's not very pleasant. Having the humility to say, there's some kind of way I'm thinking about it that is holding it in place.
Right.
Is the only way out.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, it's like, otherwise I will have just trapped myself in a prison of my own mind.
That's right. And for a lot of people, that's the worst prison they could ever live in, is a prison of their own mind, right? And it's so important to tell yourself good stories. It's so important to set goals and to say, I told you so, right? That confidence enables you to continue to move forward in telling yourself so. I can do this. I know that I can. And the little wins. We've talked about little wins a lot of times. I count my little successes. And as I count the little successes, they add up to big successes. And those little successes is like, hey, it gives you the fuel to continue to move forward toward bigger and larger goals that you seek to achieve. Not that the goal and the outcome is key, because we know it's about the journey, what you learn along the way, right? But it gives you the confidence to keep moving, and to continue to strive and thrive, as one of the guests said on an earlier episode. We want to thrive.
And the small win piece, so important. The small, we hear about it, and it almost seems trite sometimes in a business context. You hear it over and over again. But more and more I'm thinking, those successes are best used as evidence, right? We catalog, this is what we did, this is what happened. This is the evidence that is moving in a certain direction on my personal journey. And from that, we develop new options. And it's much different from the flip side of that when we take obstacles and build those stories and say, I can't do this because of that. It closes us down to possibility. It's much more valuable to take the small successes and say, how do I tweak this to either a larger success, or maybe take this success and tweak it to navigate this obstacle?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to, if you put the attention too heavily on the obstacle, it's like practicing being stuck, right? You got to be careful about that. You got to be creative about the solutions that you develop.
Yep, I would agree 100%. I mentioned that I'd had a aha moment on our CPM call, and I realized that there was a story that I was telling myself. And, once you begin to work on what that story is and you begin to redevelop that story, there's so many options and opportunities that present themselves because you're seeing the world in a different light. And you move forward with more confidence, and you realize that, hey, if something doesn't happen, it may not necessarily be because of you. It may be obstacles and restrictions that others are placing on themselves, given what their mindset actually is.
And it can be somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
The truth of it is, when we find ourselves continually butting up against a situation, a lot of times we're acting in a way that the higher power is not ready to accept yet, right? It may just not be time. We may be a couple of degrees off. If we just shift just a little bit, we go right through. Lots of different ways it can happen. But I think this is one of those things that I enjoy helping people navigate things like this. I know you do too. And so, as we talk about how we can help beyond just listening to a podcast, something that we can offer organizations or individuals is navigating in this way.
That's right.
And that's fun to me, and I think it's a possibility to build a community of thinkers that think this way, that create basically transformational futures. And the time is right for it, I think.
Yep, I agree with you. The pandemic exposed a lot, and a lot of people are reassessing who they are, where they are, and it is the right time for transformation. And one of the biggest things that the pandemic brought up, and I've said this before on other podcasts, is that it brought uncertainty and ambiguity to a visceral level, right? Because they've always existed. We just were not paying attention that there's this level of uncertainty. There's a level of ambiguity in everything that we do. But until the pandemic happened, it just wasn't in our face the same way. And now that it is in our face, how do we still continue to navigate on a day-to-day basis? Because there is a need for that type of guidance out there, and I know that you and I can provide that type of guidance to organizations.
And the speed of change is the slowest it's going to be for the rest of our lives,
right?
Like,
That's right.
Always,
That's right.
Because now the thing that everybody's all in a flurry about is artificial intelligence,
Yes.
and everything that it's going to mean, and it's going to usher in huge change. And being able to navigate that, being able to get through those intersections safely, is going to be really important.
That's right.
Right. And and we will get there, and the world won't end because of it.
That's right.
It can be more stressful or it can be less stressful depending upon how we handle the intersection.
You know, it's an interesting intersection, right? Humanity, artificial intelligence. Very interesting. But what I saw the other day is someone is offered a certification in something specific to AI, and they said there are going to be 500,000 jobs available. So on one end, we're talking about the amount of jobs that are going to be eliminated because of AI. But then I see there's 500,000 jobs that are going to be created in this space alone, right? And so the only way to get there is to be prepared for and get certified in this, whatever this AI piece is, right? And it's interesting because as one door, as we've heard this before, as one door closes, there's always another door that's going to open. You just got to be able to see it, right? And if you're not telling yourself, if you're telling yourself that there's not going to be another door, there won't be another door.
That's
If you tell yourself that there will be because you told yourself so, then you'll find it. It may take a little bit of time, but you'll find what that door is, right? And then you can enter that door and more opportunities. And so, is the universe is friendly? Yes, it is. You just got to be prepared.
Yep. And you got to be constantly willing to tell yourself a different story. And that's brought us really full circle to our title, I Told Me So. Mm-hmm. I can tell myself a different story and make it true in many cases, or at least move in a different direction. We want to thank you for listening to us today. If you would like to hear more of our episodes, unlikelyintersection.com, Unlikely Intersections on YouTube or Facebook. You can find me at Doc Philip Brown on LinkedIn, Philip Brown on Facebook, and at docphilipbrown.com.
Yep.
And how about you, Terry?
You can find me, Terry Jackson, PhD, LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook. If you Google me, you can probably find some things on me as well. So we appreciate you taking the time to listen and to view our podcast. We ask that you please comment, share, and like. So until the next time,
We'll see you at the next intersection.